Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM News Talk Radio. In my continuing endeavor to bring you interviews with interesting people that are doing some important things for our economy, I wanted to introduce you tonight to Josipa Petrunic. No, that's not right.
Close enough, Petrunic.
Petrunic. And she is the CEO and Executive Director of a fascinating organization called the Canadian Urban Research Innovation Consortium, or CUTRIC for short. And they're interested in helping to build a low-carbon, sustainable public transportation system. And they've been really talking about things like electrical cars, battery electrical buses, hydrogen fuel cells, etc. And I really wanted to chat with her both about what they have been doing, what they're going to be doing, and if it's impacted by COVID-19. So,
It's Josipa, not to worry. Don't worry, I'll help you out. Yeah.
Josipa, welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. How are you?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm doing well.
Good. So tell me, how long have you been with CUTRIC, and tell me a little bit about what your organization is all about.
Sure. So CUTRIC stands for the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium, as you noted. And it's a long name, but pretty much what we do is low carbon smart mobility. And mostly we focus on technology projects. That's pretty much all we do. Our technology demonstration projects that advance low carbon smart mobility in Canada. So anything that makes transit greener, faster, cheaper, and better for Canadians is what we do. Some of the big things that we do are projects like integration of electric buses, hydrogen fuel cell buses, autonomous smart shuttles for first kilometer, last kilometer problems, and now a lot of big data work. And so pretty much my job is to figure out a way to make Canada a leader in low carbon smart mobility tech and to create a lot of jobs while doing it. So that's what we focus on at CUTRIC.
And are we a leader today?
We are a leader in certain areas. We're a leader in the manufacture and design of particular components, things like electric buses. We manufacture and design electric buses in Canada. We're real leaders in that. We are leaders still, surprisingly so, in the hydrogen fuel cell sector, innovators and leaders in that sector, and leaders in electrolyzers. That leadership position is under threat, of course, though, because we do not actually procure, deploy a lot of hydrogen fuel cell technology in Canada. And our ability to maintain even our foothold in electric bus manufacturing design really depends on our ability to deploy those technologies in this country. So it's a classic problem in Canada across technology domains that we design and innovate a lot of intellectual property. And then when it gets to a certain level, it is exported and better deployed in other countries. So the public transit sector is an area where it could be a technology demonstrator, it could be a technology pull. And if we got more battery electric bus and hydrogen fuel cell systems out the door, we would be able to retain the foreign direct investment in these critical sectors.
And what's your background? How did you come to CUTRIC?
Well, my background, I'm actually a philosopher of mathematics and historian of mathematics. It all connects in my head.
Hold it. You're a historian of mathematics?
Yeah, that was what
is a historian of mathematics.
I worked on 19th century quaternion mathematics, which is a branch of mathematics predating what we generally consider to be linear algebra today. So a branch of mathematics that's actually found revival in computer sciences in the 21st century.
Cool. Okay. Well, that's it.
I think so.
We could have a whole separate conversation about the history of mathematics. But let's come back to, so you're a mathematical genius, and what brought you to CUTRIC?
Yeah, I wouldn't say mathematical genius. I'm definitely a political junkie as well. And so CUTRIC is, it's an innovative consortium that was built out of two parallel pathways. So the first was years ago, I was a researcher at McMaster University. And when I was there, it was right at the time post-recession when Barack Obama was investing a lot of money in the revival of the automotive sector in the United States. And this was money that was being pumped out of the Recovery Act and into Michigan and other automotive sectors in order to really motivate their movement towards autonomous vehicles and electrified powertrain at a time when nobody was buying electric cars and autonomous vehicles were a dream of the future. At that time, my role at McMaster was really to try and do the same thing in Canada and create an electric vehicle innovation center. And so we focused on doing that over several years, pulling together several large companies, industry players, utilities, to try to get an electric vehicle and autonomous vehicle consortium going in this country that would compete with Michigan in the automotive sector in the United States for the future of mobility. And over the course of 3 years, we did a great job, pulled together a lot of industry investment. But like everything, you go after seed financing. And we went after seed financing at the federal level. And at the time, it was a different government under Stephen Harper. And there was no motivation to invest in that sector. It was very clear in our final review that diesel was the way of the future, according to the government at that time. So there was really no way to kickstart an electric vehicle innovation consortium in the country back in 2013, 2014. While over in transit, the transit sector was trying to do the same thing in public transit. So there were large companies like Bombardier, and there were loads of transit agencies like STM and Metrolinx that were bemoaning appropriately the fact that it was impossible to do public transit innovation in Canada. Because if you look at transit agencies, they are not set up to get data analysts or technologists onto their teams. And so CUTRIC was formed out of the merger of our experience at McMaster and how to do electric vehicle innovation with the public transit desire to do transit innovation across the country. And that is where CUTRIC came from, as an innovation consortium that pursues these kinds of projects across the nation.
Well, we're having a fascinating chat tonight with the CEO and Executive Director of CUTRIC, which is interested in environmentally friendly ways of transportation and transit. We're going to take a break for some messages and be right back in just a minute, so stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960 AM. We're chatting tonight with Josipa Petrunic, who leads
CUTRIC. Almost. That was 80%. That was good. It's a good movement.
Who leads CUTRIC. CUTRIC is the Canadian Urban Research Innovation Consortium. And as Josipa has been chatting with us, really what they're interested in is spurring us all to be using in the transit sector more sustainable, environmentally friendly transit units, transit or opportunities. So, you know, let's, if we could, go through some of them. So we talked about electrical buses. What do you think the status is of electrical buses? Or you mentioned hydrogen buses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so right now in Canada, we don't have a huge number of battery electric buses, and we have 0 hydrogen fuel cell buses out on the road. And it's really important to clarify that when we talk about electric buses or hydrogen fuel cell buses, we're not actually just talking about a new type of propulsion system, like a bus to replace a diesel bus. When you bring in to a fleet battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell buses, you are actually overhauling the entire energy system of that fleet. So it's not just the bus, it's the charger and the fueling system and the energy storage device and the smart controls and the utility business, the business development around providing those electrons, either for hydrogen or for the battery propulsion directly. So it's a complete overhaul of the fueling system, the energy structure, and the vehicle that riders happen to get onto. So right now in Canada, we've got some dozens of buses, mostly deployed in Toronto, Montreal, and with our Pan-Canadian Electric Bus Project, we have an initiative with 18 electric buses deployed in Vancouver, now in York Region, and soon by the end of this year in Brampton. And that project is the first time in the world that multiple manufacturers of battery electric buses are plugging into multiple manufacturers of overhead charging systems. And that allows for interoperability and standardization, and it allows for the price point of these vehicle units to drop down. So we're not the world leaders in deploying electric buses. By volume, that's China, and by numbers of units in terms of interoperability and deployment by systems, it's Europe and the US that follow thereafter. But we're not that far behind either, and we've got a leading industry. What we now need to do in Canada is really move towards mass joint procurements. So that's on the battery electric side, both for hydrogen and, that's on the electric side, both for hydrogen and battery electric.
So I guess the answer to this question is obvious, but let's talk it through. I've heard statistics like 40% of our climate change gases come from the transportation sector. A fair amount of that's got to be from buses. You're saying that a lot of these buses currently are running on diesel, and so therefore switching to electricity or hydrogen is a benefit. Why is hydrogen a benefit?
Yeah, well, actually, I'll just maybe correct the stat a little bit to make it a worst case scenario and then argue why it's actually a great case scenario. So of that 40% or so piece of the pie that comes from transportation, really only about 1% comes from transit. And so people often say, well, why spend all the taxpayer dollars on electrification of transit, battery or hydrogen, when it's such a small piece of the GHG pie, the greenhouse gas emissions? The reason is because the charging systems that you use for these buses and the hydrogen fueling systems you use for buses are the same designs that you use for coaches and trucks. And trucks are a huge amount of the pollution pie. So if we can get the charging infrastructure out the door, which is very different from the infrastructure and the fueling infrastructure for cars, you get it out the door for public transit buses, you have now created the nationwide network required for interregional and intercity trucking. And that is where the real environmental wins are. Now on the hydrogen side, for folks who aren't familiar with hydrogen buses, because they've been around for a long time, at least the promise of hydrogen vehicles, hydrogen buses in Canada today are electric buses. They're the same kind of design. They operate off battery power that feeds into a motor. The difference is you have a hydrogen fuel cell generator on board that produces the electrons. So you don't have to plug the bus into the grid at night or over the day. You have a hydrogen generator on board. It operates like a range extender, if people know what plug-in hybrids look like. The fact that you usually have a gasoline extender on that powertrain that helps the vehicle go further when the battery runs out. That's how hydrogen fuel cell buses operate. It is a great news story for Canada. Not only do we make the technology here, we produce a lot of hydrogen. A lot of it's not purified to the level needed. It's coming out of the oil and gas sector, but it could be purified to the level needed. We have a lot of green electricity, and the cleanest, greenest hydrogen is produced right from the electricity grid through electrolysis, where you break up a water molecule to make hydrogen. So there's a great ecosystem in the country. And the great thing about hydrogen fuel cell buses is where battery electric buses do really, really well is in downtown stop-start heavy ridership. Where hydrogen fuel cell buses do really, really well and compete with diesel is high rapid speed highway routes, interregional routes, the kind of routes that go from Ottawa to Nepean. Those kinds of routes are really difficult for battery electric buses, but hydrogen fuel cell buses can deliver them. So when you combine battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell buses, you can get to zero emissions transit fleets. And if you deploy that infrastructure, you get to zero emissions trucking. And that is what's needed to save the world.
Okay, so hydrogen is something that we're going to be putting into a tank, and it goes into an engine and it burns. But because there's no carbon molecule in the hydrogen, you're not creating any greenhouse gases. Is that correct?
Yeah, in general, there's two ways of getting hydrogen. One is through steam methane reformation, and one is through electrolysis. Electrolysis is where you take a bunch of electrons, you shove them through a water molecule, you break the hydrogen off of the oxygen, and you're left with oxygen and hydrogen. So oxygen is not too bad of a thing as a byproduct. Then you take that hydrogen, you run it back through a fuel cell stack. That then recombines with an oxygen molecule, and you get electrons out the door that power your vehicle. So not too bad, because no carbon dioxide is produced out of that whole process. All that's produced is you destroy a water molecule and then you recreate a water molecule. So out of your tailpipe are a bunch of droplets of pure water, so pure that you can actually drink it. But that form of electrolysis is not well developed across the country. We make electrolyzers. And right now in North Toronto, Enbridge is producing hydrogen with a company, Hydrogenics, that makes the electrolyzer. It is green, clean hydrogen, but it's not connected to a distribution chain that supports vehicle fueling. So it's higher cost than diesel right now until we get to the right volumes. So where can you go for low cost hydrogen? Steam methane reformation is the normal process, and that does create carbon dioxide. It's where you take a methane molecule, you break it up, and rather than having methane that pollutes the atmosphere at 18 times a CO2 molecule, you end up with a CO2 molecule and a hydrogen molecule that you can power your vehicle with. It's not as green as electrolysis, but it is greener than letting the methane go into the air in the first instance. Both methods are possible. Both are available today to power zero emissions buses.
Now, the criticism that I've heard about hydrogen, and again, please correct me because I'm undoubtedly wrong, is that it has to either be super chilled or held in a very high pressure tank, and so therefore it ends up being quite expensive.
Definitely pressure is a critical thing, right? Because it is gaseous in its natural state. So when you do create hydrogen, you do have to compress it, pressurize it. And that means you have to stick it on pressurized vehicles to transport it. And then you have to have it in compressed, pressurized tanks in order to fuel at the right pressure so that it can go from the pressurized tank into the tank of the vehicle. There's no doubt about that. And that does consume energy. And so folks have in the past said, well, that's less efficient than plugging into the grid directly. That is true. You know, from well to wheel, it's less efficient than just pulling electrons off the electricity grid. But it is way more efficient than exploding a diesel molecule in an inefficient combustion engine, which is what we do right now to produce propulsion. So compared to diesel and even compared to natural gas, hydrogen propulsion is an extremely efficient process, even when you include the pressurization required.
Now, what about ammonia? I've had someone pitch me that a lot of streetcars across North America ran on ammonia in the early 1900s. And again, all that came out of the tailpipes was droplets of water. And similar to nitrogen, there's no carbon molecule. And so therefore, when you burn it in something like an internal combustion engine, you create the same power that you described, but without the need for super chilling and or pressure. Does that make any sense?
Well, so I mean, there's loads of alternative fuels out there. Ammonia having been one of the types of fuels that was used, but there are loads of fuels. There are also steam-powered vehicles in the 19th century and 20th century, and they were quite clean vehicles as well. But it's not enough to have a clean profile or a clean burning process. You also have to have a supply chain, and you have to be able to scale. So I can affirm that ammonia right now is not one of the fuels that we're seeing, crop up at a commercial scale that would make sense.
Even though it's shipped across North America to be used as fertilizer on farms. So there's already a distribution system and a supply chain.
No one to say that it might not reappear in the future. Unfortunately, it's not one of the fuels that's cropping up right now as the kind of standard go-to for alternative propulsion. But I'll do some research and come back to you as to whether that is a potential in the future. You never know. I mean, having said that, there are all sorts of new types of fuels that are emerging, synthetic fuels that are emerging. And of course, not to ignore the fact that even within the diesel sector, there's biodiesel and new forms of diesel that are emerging in order to reduce emissions overall. So, far be it for me to suggest that only battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell are the fuels of the future, but you do need to get to a certain level of supply chain readiness. And then you also have to have vehicle propulsion systems that are designed around those types of fuels. One of the kinds of nouveau fuels that has not gotten nearly enough press in Canada, but which could be a real winner, is renewable natural gas. So if I had to bet the mortgage, I'd probably bet it on renewable natural gas.
Okay, hold it. I haven't heard this. Explain to me what renewable natural gas is, please.
Oh. Sorry, I think I just got some interference there. I'm not sure if you can hear that. Are you able to hear me?
Renewable natural gas. What's renewable natural gas?
So renewable natural gas is a form of natural gas that comes from, as the moniker suggests, renewable sources. In other words, agricultural feedstock and our poop, basically. So you take stuff out of waste landfills that is decomposing and basically producing methane that goes into the atmosphere and causes greenhouse gas effects. If you could capture that methane, it is a form of natural gas. If you could capture that methane and get it into the piping system and distribution system that natural gas is currently occupying, you would be able to displace fracked natural gas with renewable sources. And currently, there are loads of natural gas vehicles out there, including buses. Calgary Transit has compressed natural gas buses. Other transit agencies like Hamilton have compressed natural gas buses. You could use what already exists, compressed natural gas buses, and implement renewable natural gas into the pipeline system to reduce the overall carbon dioxide footprint of that form of fuel. That is a big winner in Canada. A few years ago, there wasn't nearly enough renewable natural gas supplies. As of today, there are a lot more renewable natural gas supplies. So when you consider the overall life cycle, these vehicles exist. They're already well maintained, well operated. Introducing RNG into the compressed natural gas supply chain could radically reduce emissions while propelling vehicles that from well to wheel or over the life cycle have a net zero emissions profile.
So I'm aware of some of the, I think they were called anaerobic digesters that were taking as you describe it, poop, some of the natural waste, organic waste, et cetera, from farms and meat plants and chicken plants and poultry plants and things like that, and turning it into methane and then turning it into natural gas. I think the problem was they could never get scale. And that was the challenge. And there were even some proposals to build huge anaerobic digesters in London, Ontario, for an example, that would take a whole bunch of sewage and convert it into something. And the sort of the NIMBYism became crazy, and people really reacted negatively to have big sewage treatment plants, which we currently have, but not doing what they currently do, turning them into gases, and that's what was the problem. Do you think that these natural gas, organic natural gas solutions are scalable and could be a solution?
Well, that was an issue for us about 4 or 5 years ago when we started a natural gas initiative at CUTRIC. We were trying to figure out, are there enough sources to start with, even if you wanted to do this? And then secondly, if there are sources, are they scalable? You have to have enough supply that you could power 10, 20, 50, 100 buses, not just 1 or 2 buses or 1 or 2 trucks. That was a concern several years ago, and we were looking at digesters out in Oxford County and whether that was possible. At that time, and still today, there's an ongoing philosophical argument that you don't want to set the wrong triggers, because you could ironically lead to a perverse motivation to produce waste in order to produce renewable natural gas if the business triggers were right and the profit margin was good enough. I think the industry has matured enough circa 2020 that there's more than enough feedstock, there's more than enough naturally occurring renewable natural gas, shall we say, and distribution and supply chains that are starting to aggregate and coordinate and rationalize. Enbridge is a real leader in this sector in terms of pulling together its existing natural gas resources and assets and trying to integrate a coordinated supply chain. There are others, and frankly, as an Albertan originally, you take a look at the petroleum sector and the pressures it's under, there's a lot of motivation and a lot of existing assets out there that could be moved toward a renewable natural gas ecosystem. So it is scalable, it is doable, it's more developed today than it's ever been developed before. The challenge is that a lot of attention has gone to battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell for very good reason, and I'm a big supporter of both those technologies, but there's certainly a space for long distance, well understood renewable natural gas or natural gas propulsion systems as well.
We're chatting tonight with the CEO and Executive Director of CUTRIC, which is an organization here in Canada that is working on sustainable transit and transportation solutions. We're going to take a quick break for messages and come back more. And I'm going to ask her about an upcoming conference that she's got. And also I want to find out how any of their plans have changed with COVID-19. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. My gosh, what an interesting conversation this afternoon with one of the brightest people I've had the privilege of chatting with in a long time. And I really want to go back to the first conversation we had where she said she was a mathematical historian, because that sounds really quite interesting. Something about math before linear algebraic, or I don't know, something like that.
Almost 90%.
But we're going to talk about sustainable transportation, and CUTRIC is an organization that is working on sustainable development of transit and transportation. And you've got an upcoming conference, and tell us, please, if you could, about this conference.
Yeah, sure. So every year for the last few years, we've done a conference across Canada for low carbon smart mobility, basically trying to create the place to go in Canada to talk about electric buses, hydrogen fuel cell buses, electrified coaches, and autonomous smart shuttles for that first kilometer, last kilometer problem. Everything that is transit technology, that's our conference. And for the last year, we did it in Winnipeg, and before that in Ottawa and Montreal. And this year we were all set to go in Winnipeg in June, and alas, COVID struck. And as you saw, one by one, conferences started canceling. And my position is we're an innovation consortium. We do not have the option of canceling. We're innovators, so we must innovate, and we would be shamed if we didn't innovate. So we stuck to our guns, and our conference is running June 17th to 19th as previously planned, but in a fully virtual platform. And we've transitioned over. It has 3 core elements. One is all things you need to know about battery electric buses, their chargers, their energy storage systems, their smart controls. That's a big core theme, and we have a bunch of transit agencies from TTC to TransLink to Edmonton Transit, and some of our American partners joining us to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly around electric buses. There were a lot of sales over science a few years ago and promises of angelic performance. Everybody knows the laws of physics don't lie, so we really do want the real story from our transit agencies to talk about how best to procure and integrate these systems from lessons learned. So that's the first big pillar. The second big pillar is around smart shuttles. Those are the autonomous connected shuttles that carry 6 to 20 people. And the intention there is they're driverless shuttles that connect you from your transit hub, your GO station, your Calgary LRT to your home, your place of work, the zoo, the science center, all those places where there's about 1 kilometer to 2 kilometers between the transit hub and the place you want to get to. And in the winter, with high heels and a skirt and a briefcase or a baby carriage, you just don't want to walk it. And most Canadians don't walk it. And so we get into our cars and drive.
I got to interrupt you and tell you, so I ended up having some car problem this past year. And I take the GO train, or I did before COVID-19, took the GO train into downtown Toronto. And so I ended up starting to use Uber a lot, every day to get to the GO train. And I park in a parking lot when I drive that is a good 7-minute, maybe 6-minute walk. Like it's in a blistering snowstorm, it's terrible. Having that ability to get dropped off right at the GO train station was unbelievably convenient. And if you could do that through an autonomous shuttle,
that's right. On demand, nonetheless, and connected, so you can answer your emails on the way to work fee-free. I mean, this is the goal, and therefore you'll be interested in that second pillar of our conference, Brian. So I encourage you to attend because it's all things autonomous driverless to connect those hubs. And in Canada, we've got oodles of these problems. We've got a great GO network and a great EXO network and great LRTs in Edmonton and Calgary. But you try to get from those stations to suburbia, and it's extremely difficult. So that first kilometer.
The thing I heard was that Metrolinx for a while was spending more on their parking garages than they were on their transportation, on their transit.
It's an absolute North American problem. And, real estate constraints being as they are, that land is wasted as parking spots. So getting people to those hubs and moving them efficiently is critical. And making sure if you stay at work late and you're getting home at 8 o'clock, that you don't miss the only bus that comes around in 60 minutes, that you can on demand a shuttle. And people have said, well, why are you focusing so much on that at the conference? There's Uber and their Lyft. Yeah, but do you know an Uber Lyft drive from my place to Union, which I can walk in 20 minutes, is about $16. $16 is a lot of money. The average Canadian household income is in the $50,000 range. Let's get a grip on reality here. This is a lot of money. So to be able to afford Uber and Lyft rides puts us in a privileged class already. So what is the price point for you, especially if you have a family? If you could get a $3, a $4 on-demand, swank, connected, autonomous shuttle to come pick you up, not $16 Uber or Lyft ride, would you do it for $3 or $4? Sure you would. Lots of people would, especially if it meant that they didn't have to pay for parking. So that's the whole second part of our conference.
I think it's a brilliant idea, and I think you should combine it with the Presto card in the exact same charge system. And effectively, you should get a break for using that versus the cost of it because GO Transit, Metro Transit, the province isn't going to be having to build those big parking garages.
Absolutely. And I would go even farther, and that leads into the third part of our conference, which is big data and big data analytics for better mobility. I think I deserve shoppers optimum points for getting on transit bus. I should be rewarded as a Canadian with some benefit at no frills or Tim Hortons credits. I should get something for every kilometer I am on a shared mobility device, whether it's a bus, a coach, a train, or an autonomous shuttle. And if I had one card to rule them all, not a Presto card here and an Opus card there and an Oyster card over there, if I had one integrated digital fare system that rewarded me as a client of transit, not a rider or a user, a client of a service, then we would start to see the shift towards transit as the middle class choice rather than the last obligated option you have when you can't afford a car, which is how we treat transit still in North America today. So that's the third part of the conference, is talking about all those data savvy solutions that treat transit users not as users but as clients who deserve a better service. So that's the conference.
Sounds like a great conference. All the best for it. As you know, I'm chair of Transit Alliance, a civic advocacy organization spurring on transit development. And we've gone virtual as well. And we had a session last week with Phil Verster, the CEO of Metrolinx, and the head of infrastructure for KPMG, that was talking about a lot of challenges that the transit sector are faced with right now. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to have Caroline Mulroney, the Minister of Transportation provincially. And we did them virtually for the first time. And it was interesting because I think people found it really efficient from an information sharing standpoint. But I was fascinated. People still want to interact. And so one of the benefits of our dinners and of your conferences historically has been the ability to interact. And what I did by just sort of happenstance, and you may want to think about this, is I left the Zoom call open when the formal session was over. And lots of people logged off, but lots of people didn't log off. And they ended up chatting back and forth. And we ended up having a really interesting interaction. And what it showed was, these people want the information, and the virtual way of getting the information is actually probably more efficient, but they still want to chat and they still want to talk. They want to make connections. They want to talk about business opportunities. They want to find out what people are up to. So think about how you can also add in that networking spat.
Absolutely. And, I think innovatively, there's a lot of ways that you can help people network online that are also not possible physically. Physically at a conference, you actually still have to be able to get there, take the time off, get on a flight, usually in Canada, arrive somewhere, afford a hotel room. So we are looking at all sorts of ways in which we can have the virtual beer time and virtual networking, because people got to gab. And we all have a story to tell, and networking needs to happen, especially in this post-COVID world or trans-COVID world and pandemic world where we're all desperate for human connection. Okay, so I will take your advice.
Let's talk about that. How has COVID-19 changed things? And I mentioned Phil Verster, CEO of Metrolinx. Some of the obvious questions, and I don't have the answer for Metrolinx, but the TTC said their revenue was down by 80%. China supposedly transit use, as they've come out of the pandemic and they're reopening, is down by 40%, and personal private car usage is almost doubling. And so, people are worried about going on transit and are getting back in their cars, which is not necessarily what you and I have been focused on.
Yeah, that's right.
How are you changing what you're thinking about, what you're researching based on this pandemic?
Yeah, well, people have asked us, does your vision even matter? Like, who cares about the climate when we're all worried about getting infected? Having said that, I don't know anybody who wants more smog in the air right now, who's looking in the air of respiratory illness saying pollute my air more. So I don't think climate change is going anywhere. And certainly I don't think we have a prime minister who's setting himself up to disappoint his kids, right? So climate investment is not going anywhere. Climate change action is not going anywhere. Investment into the eco-economy is not going anywhere. Federally, the course is going to be stayed. So I think investments in that sector are not going anywhere. If anything, this is now the time to say it's got to be increased. So why did we ever accept crush capacity to start with? Why did we ever accept being squished like sardines on a subway? Why was that ever acceptable to start with? This may be the time to start talking about better interior design, better seat design, connectivity on the tube or the subway or the bus, making it the place people want to go such that they don't want to get back in their cars because there's better amenities, there's better social life, and there's better safety in the transit industry. Now, is that going to happen overnight? No. People are forced to face the fact that transit gets the bad rap, right? We don't talk about clustering on transit, or rather, we don't talk about clustering at concerts or birthday parties or anywhere else as badly as we do at transit. And so one of our focus points at CUTRIC is we acknowledge that our vision still holds, making Canada a global leader in low carbon smart mobility. But the smart element is critical. That means smarter design and smarter design in a pandemic world. So we're pulling together, we've got about 20 universities at CUTRIC, and we've started pulling together proposals for the next 6 months as to how our brightest minds in this country can offer transit manufacturers and transit agencies immediate recommendations on how to make transit the place people want to go back to, how to get people back to transit safely, securely, and better than they could ever do in their own passenger cars. So we're working on that. I think COVID has only just motivated us. And I'll be frank in saying, I mean, I'm 40 years old and I've said it before, I plan to live to 100. I have planned to live a very productive life. I have no doubt there will be a worse COVID scenario. I have absolutely no doubt, with climate change being as it is, all models for the last 12, 20 years have already predicted the extent of an extension of tropical illnesses north of the 45th parallel, right? So at the end of the day, we've already expected a movement northward of tropical illnesses. COVID caught us off guard, one might argue, but there's been a lot of arguments to say that the expansion through globalization of illnesses worldwide is also supported by the climate change events that we are experiencing and the ability of new pathogens to exist in climates that they wouldn't have necessarily extended to. So having said all that, whether it's COVID redux or some form of extreme Zika or whatever other form extends, I have no doubt there'll be something even worse in the future, and transit can't stop. Not all of us can afford cars. Not all of us want cars. And how many people actually want to live out their life behind the wheel of a car when we start calculating our lost hours and congestion? So it is our obligation and duty to find solutions in the next 6 months to 12 months to make transit the place you want to be again, and make it safe enough that you want to bring your family, and safer than your car could be.
Wow. That's quite the speech. So, for the last couple of years, I've been commuting every week, and every week I commute to either Ottawa or New York or Boston. And then when I'm not commuting for half the week, I'm on a GO train to downtown Toronto, because I've got an office in downtown Toronto, and I've got an office in Ottawa and another one in New York. And that's sort of the style of a lot of people over the course of the last couple of years. For the last 2 months, I've worked from my home office. And I've used Zoom, and I've used Microsoft something or other, and FaceTime something or other, and a bunch of other technology. And you know what? It's been pretty productive. And I've saved 2 hours, 2.5 hours of commute time. And quality of life is okay.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think people are going to go back to working downtown? Are we going to learn to do a lot more from home offices?
I love big cities. I love density. So I certainly hope people return, because I just love humanity being around me. Put me in nature for too long and I go a little bit bonkers. So I do need the made environment of humanity congested. Having said that, consider my own offices. We have office in Montreal and Toronto. And in March, I decided by the end of March to cancel our office space. So my staff is working from home and will be for the rest of the year. And the reason is a similar driver to a lot of SMEs and technology innovators. Even if we're allowed to return to work, I cannot guarantee that I can keep my staff 6 feet apart. I don't know what my insurance will look like. I don't know that I can keep them 6 feet apart. I can't afford that amount of space to keep them 6 feet apart. So it's better that folks work at home. Now, in our industry, working at home is not hard because we're already heavily digitized. And a lot of our employees are data scientists and analysts and researchers. Not all businesses are in that space and scope, and some businesses are fundamentally dependent on human interaction. So I do think there is going to be a cultural shift. I do think a lot more people have reassessed the time they've recouped for family life. I also think there's going to be a heck of a lot more divorces in the next 6 months as well. I mean, humanity comes with its foibles, right? But has it changed our willingness to spend 2 hours in congested highway on the parking lot that is the QEW? I think for a certain class of worker, yes. There's going to be those workers who have no choice. Nurses, teachers, others who have to get to a physical location have no choice but to do so. But for a very large chunk of the voting population and the middle class population and the average salaried population, it's going to be a game changer around how they spend the hours of their life, family or on a highway. And that may counterbalance the move towards car ownership and car usage on a daily travel pattern. But I don't leave it to people alone. I think you only move humanity when you hit it in the pocketbook. So we do need to start considering really seriously the idea John Tory put forward, which he was right to do a couple years ago, road pricing. Because if we leave it just to people to decide, I'm going to protect panda bears, they're not going to do it. If we leave it just to people to think about their own safety and security, they're going to get in their own cars and not think about the net effect on the rest of society. If we don't have any negative price triggers, we cannot rely only on the carrots and incentivization of beautiful, clean, connected, Wi-Fi enabled subways. We're going to have to hit people in the pocketbook, and that does mean road pricing. And that goes beyond just transit. That goes to rebuilding our cities into the kind of livable, safe environments we want for downtown global environments overall. So, that kind of dialogue, road pricing may seem completely isolated from something like pandemic. It is entirely appropriate to start discussing how cities are going to create new revenues in this pandemic world where we cannot afford to have congestion times 10 on the highway streets that are already congested. So that's where I think we're going with it. I also think that there's going to be new taxpayer-led discussions. Torontonians are really going to start to ask, why are we paying for infrastructure that we're not using primarily? That's going to become more and more poignant as we start to look at who is using the QEW and the Gardiner and who is not, who's working from home in their middle class jobs that they can do so. So that taxpayer discussion, I think, is coming around the corner, and it's an appropriate one for Canadians to have.
When you want to affect humanity, you have to hit them in the pocketbook. What a great quote. We're having a really interesting chat tonight with the Executive Director and CEO of CUTRIC about sustainable development of transit and transportation. We're going to take a quick break for messages and come back with some concluding comments. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're talking about sustainable development of transit and transportation tonight with the founder and CEO of the executive director and CEO of CUTRIC, which is an organization that's really working on sustainable development of transit and transportation, primarily buses, last mile shuttles from GO trains and subways and things like that. And has a big conference coming up that is going to be talking about a lot of these issues. One of the things that you mentioned is that you want to get people back on the transit in a more healthy, public health consistent manner. I've got one suggestion for you, if I could. I think in London, England, the UK, if you use the underground either before like 6:30 or after like 10:30, it's 50% of the price. Why not just use differential pricing so we don't have to get everyone crammed into the GO trains between like 7:30 and 8:30 in the morning?
100% agree. It's called demand management, and it exists in the utility sector and in other sectors. You know, why do we have time of use? Why is it cheaper to wash your laundry at 2 in the morning than 5 in the afternoon? Because it's called demand management, right? We try to manage people's usage of, in that case, energy in order to distribute the demand, and that can give you some cost savings. We can do the exact same thing with transit, but it requires data. It requires data. So for example, imagine you're downtown, you're working, or you're in the suburbs, and you get a message on your phone that says, hey, Josipa, you know, consider working half an hour longer. And if you leave your office in half an hour, or here, use this coupon to go buy yourself a Starbucks coffee, but don't get on transit for 45 minutes. If you get on transit 45 minutes from now, your ride will be 10 cents. But if you get on right now, it'll be $6. If I had those kinds of signals, automated, data-driven, to my profile that I have with consent handed over to a transit network in the interest of the public, of course I would work for 45 minutes longer and get my Starbucks and get onto a 10-cent ride.
Okay. This raises another big issue. You said your third track was all about big data.
That's right.
We've heard, a lot of criticism about sidewalks in Toronto and their big data, collecting all the information about where we walk, how much trash we put out, all this kind of different stuff. And now sidewalks is pulled out. Is big data something that people will support?
Absolutely. So, I mean, back to the example of getting that message, right? If the transit agency were empowered with all the data about its clients and its users and had the ability to communicate that to them, they could really demand manage that profile and really reduce costs and improve the ridership experience. Now, take it at a higher level. Several years ago, we realized that transit agencies weren't really tracking their electric buses or their fuel cell buses. Today, transit does have telemetry devices. The larger systems have loggers on their buses so they know where they are, GPS tracking, etc. But what doesn't exist still today is the culture of sharing that data across cities. So we've created a big data trust concept, and we're getting Brampton and York Region and Vancouver and now hopefully TTC and other agencies to start feeding their data from their electric buses and buses into a cloud platform. So every city can see each other's buses in operation, each other's chargers in operation in real time. And why would that be a great thing? Because we're trying to get it launched this year. It would be a great thing because it leads to evidence-based procurement. It leads to you buying the most efficient types of vehicles and charging systems and fueling systems that money can buy. It leads you to avoid being sold on products by really swank sales, and allows you to have sales over science for the taxpayer efficiency. So that kind of data sharing just has never happened before, in part technologically because up until a few years ago, cloud computing didn't really exist at enough of a scale for transit to do it. And up until even now, transit never had the kind of data analysts on staff that would allow it to do that kind of sharing. So it took a consortium to start pulling that together and make it culturally okay to share your data across agencies. For manufacturers, they now have the ability, once that gets launched, to actually see how their units are performing in real time. That gives the power to cities to actually say, you know what, you sold us this bus, you told us it would operate in a certain way, it's degrading faster than you told us, so here's a penalty measure you're going to have to pay back to the taxpayer if you can't meet the performance measure you sold us on. That's extremely powerful data. Where Sidewalk faced challenges was Sidewalk was really looking at tracking a lot of, well, the concern was the tracking of the personal data. Where we've started to focus is the tracking of the buses, the assets, the units that the taxpayer pays for. So not the personal data, But I do believe if you can create a data trust that tracks those assets and shows how it benefits the taxpayer primarily and delivers better transit products, it will create the cultural ability for transit to also communicate with me directly based on my personal information to offer me a free Tim Hortons coffee if I stay at my office 30 minutes longer and get a 10-cent ride because they demand managed me. So you can't necessarily start with the personal, you got to start with the impersonal assets, but you can build the data trust in the Canadian context in the interest of cities.
Well, if we had someone like you in charge, I think we would be able to do it because you convince everyone of its validity. So we're chatting tonight with Josipa Petrunic, who leads CUTRIC. CUTRIC is the Canadian Urban Research Innovation Consortium that is looking at the benefits of battery electric buses, hydrogen fuel cells, public fleets, the role of big data, and last mile electrical shuttles. It's been a fascinating conversation. We're going to take a final break for messages, and then I'm going to come back with some concluding comments. What a fantastic chat. If people want to check you out, is there a website that you've got?
There is. It is www.cutric-critique, which is the French acronym.org. So that's CUTRIC-CRITUC.org.
Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be back in just a minute. Stay with us. Well, what a fascinating conversation tonight with, and I'm going to pronounce her name wrong again, I apologize, but Josipa Petrunic, who is the CEO and Executive Director of CUTRIC. And CUTRIC sounds like an incredible organization that's really trying to work hard to get us all to a better future, because we're going to be using low carbon electrical buses or shuttles. I love her explanation about how we can start with the buses and then they create the infrastructure that the trucks can use in the future. And so I think it's a fascinating conversation. As lots of you may know that have listened to my shows in the past, I'm chairman of a civic advocacy organization called Transit Alliance. And our objective is to spur sustainable continued transit investment, because I really do think that it is one of the keys. I tried to challenge her a little bit to see if people would be staying in their home offices and not go back downtown. And I had to laugh when she talked about how critically important downtown urban environments are. And you know, there's a great book that I love called The Triumph of the City by Ed Glazer. And he talks about how the size of a city increases the metabolism of the city. And there's more patents, there's more jobs, there's more income, there's more wealth, also some of the negative things in crime and pollution, etc. But that sort of power log relationship of the increased metabolism of a city as the city's size increases, decreases if you can't get around, or the linear regression of it doesn't hold if you can't get around. So the idea of great cities and great density being keys to success, that cities have been this wonderful invention of humanity that have led to huge wealth creation, breaks down if you can't get around the cities in a reasonable time, for obvious reasons, because you're stuck in your own little neighborhood and you can't interact with people from everywhere. And so highways were one invention to do that, but clearly transit is a better way to do that. And so I think CUTRIC and Transit Alliance and a lot of other organizations are looking at ways that we can do that, obviously in the future, in a public health consistent manner. What a great conversation. I got to get her back and talk about the history of math next. Thanks for joining the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're on every night, 6 o'clock, Monday to Friday on Saga 960 AM, or you can stream me online, www.saga960am.ca, or you can get all my podcasts, and most of them as videocasts on briancrombie.com / either podcasts or videocasts. Good night.